Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is the Panasonic Lumix S1H with an Atomos Ninja 5, a popular combination for pro filmmakers and one that's going to become a lot more exciting. Free firmware updates for both devices will allow the S1H to output 5.9K RAW up to 30p over HDMI to the Ninja, which will then record it in the Apple ProRes RAW format. This promises tonal and colour correction on 12-bit files with easy editing, even on fairly modest hardware. The firmware updates, initially expected in May 2020, have been delayed a little, but Panasonic and Atomos let me try out a beta version, and in this video I'll show you how it all works and the sort of results you can expect. The performance may improve on the final versions, hopefully publicly available by mid-2020, but both companies were still happy for me to evaluate this beta, so I reckon it's pretty reflective of what you can expect. So here's my S1H updated with the beta firmware, showing the standard movie options when recording internally, with the best quality being 5.9K up to 30p in 420 10-bit. So far, so normal. The firmware update though adds a new option at the bottom to enable raw data output over HDMI, and when you switch this on, the camera warns you that the footage will not be recorded internally. Now here's my Atomos Ninja 5, again updated with the beta firmware, and here's showing the information screen when being fed with the normal 10-bit output and vlog. Now as I enable RAW over HDMI from the S1H menu, which you can see faintly in the background of the Ninja screen, you'll see the recorder's information screen change to show that the camera is sending 5.9K data in a RAW format, and under the record tab you'll see that the format that's going to be recorded by the Ninja is in ProRes RAW. You can't change any of this, it's fixed. Switching back to the monitor view, here's the Waveform Guide, which is essential for working out your exposure for raw footage. In my tests I increased the exposure until the tops of the waveform were just below the maximum level, at which point the camera's normal metering system reckoned I was about 2 stops overexposed. But remember, it's not expecting the broader tonal range of RAW, and as you'll see, it's easy to dial this back on your final footage if desired. Okay, to see what it's like to work with these clips in practice, I've now moved into Final Cut Pro, and of course this is an Apple product. It now natively supports ProRes RAW, but it's a fairly modest system that I have it running on. This isn't a desktop computer or a server, it's not even a high-end laptop. This is a 2018 13-inch MacBook Pro with 16GB of RAM. It's the computer that I use to do pretty much all of my work, and I was very interested to see how it would handle 12-bit 5.9K RAW files. Okay, so the first step is to create a library that knows that it's going to be working with high dynamic range content. So on the left hand side you can see here I have my standard projects, and I've created a new library specifically for wide gamut projects. However, that's not enough. You need to go to the properties of this, modify and make sure that you have wide gamut HDR enabled. So I'm going to select that, and then when you create the project you also have to make sure that you modify or set the color space to wide gamut as well. I'm going to set it to wide gamut HDR Rec 2020 PQ because that's what I was using to monitor on the Ninja 5, so we'll select that. You'll also see that my project here is in 4K. That's because that's the maximum that I can deliver to YouTube without going all the way to 8K, which seemed a bit excessive here. So I've just gone to 4K to make it easier to deliver, and I've gone for 25p because that's what I recorded the footage in. So now we're okay. I've loaded all of my clips that I've filmed, and typically what I've done is filmed 3 scenes. First of all in the ProRes RAW format, recorded externally from the X1H onto the Ninja 5. I've also recorded an internal 10-bit vlog version and an HLG version as well, which I'll show you later on. And in 2 out of the 3 cases, I've also recorded an internal 8-bit version using the standard profile, just to show what's possible in terms of recovery. Now, if I just have a quick look at one of those internal 8-bit clips right now, you can see that the sky area is pretty saturated on this exposure in order to get some nice shadow detail on this tree on the left hand side, and this exposure or tonal range is reflected on the waveform monitor on the left hand side here. You can see that tonal range increase and then go chop. It's like someone has completely sliced it off. And if I were to go to the color wheels here and try to retrieve that highlight detail just by dialing in the dialing back the highlights here, you can see I can certainly bring those highlights down, but it is not bringing back any detail in that sky. That is fully saturated and unrecoverable on the 8-bit internal file. However, if I go to the raw file, you can see straight away how much taller that waveform is. Now, I've exposed this using the Waveform Monitor on the Ninja 5, and also on the S1H itself, it has a Waveform Monitor. And what I did was increase the exposure until the highlights were just about touching the top maximum amount. Now, this typically means that they are overexposed. As far as the S1H was concerned, it reckoned it was about 2 stops overexposed in terms of normal metering, but that means that there's going to be lots of hopefully noise-free detail in the shadows, and of course the opportunity to retrieve any of those details either at the bright end or the dark end. You can see here, just look at the size of this range, and the scale on the left hand side refers to nits of brightness, and I'm going to aim for 1K as my maximum here, 1000 nits, because that is typically what's achievable by most consumer HDR TVs. So what I could just simply do here is grab the, and you can see already on the preview here that there's some blue, some color in the sky area here, which was completely blown out on the 8-bit internal version. So if I just grab this slider here, or rather this rotational adjustment, and bring it back, you can see those waveforms shrinking on the left hand side, and I can bring that down to about 1000 nits. Now, this isn't necessarily an absolutely precise science. You can do whatever you want here. I just want to really show you what's possible in terms of highlight and shadow retrieval. And if you want, you can play about with the shadows here. I can make them darker here. I can bring them down, or I can bring them up. I can adjust the overall exposure here. You saw that it was slightly unresponsive there. It's a little bit sluggish, but remember, this is a 13-inch MacBook Pro. This is not a desktop or a serious muscle machine, so I can just about edit this footage. And it's 5.9K as well. It's not like it's even 4K or 1080. This is 5.9K raw footage, and it is adjustable within Final Cut on this laptop. Now, the interesting thing here is to also compare the raw file to the vlog version that I've also recorded. Now, if we have a look at this here, you can see that this footage looks very, very flat, and that's because we haven't got a LUT applied to it yet. So let's do that straight away. I'll go to this info section here, and from the camera LUT menu, I'm just going to choose the standard Panasonic Vlog LUT that comes with Final Cut. You could do whatever you want. You could load your own custom LUT for a different effect. But look what's happened here now, and also to the waveform here. You can see that it's retrieved a much greater tonal range to play with. So let's perform some similar adjustments to those that we did on the raw file. So what I'm going to do is just bring those highlights down. Okay, and maybe just have a little play with the shadows. So I could bring them down, make them a bit darker, or a little bit brighter. Now, if I go back and forth between these two clips and we have a look at the waveforms, so this is the 10-bit Vlog internal, and this is the 12-bit external RAW, you can see that in terms of this particular clip, there's not a massive amount between them, is there? Now, before I performed those tonal adjustments to them, you could argue that the RAW version had a little bit more latitude available to it, but it's not hugely different, and the result here is similar. However, both of them are way ahead what you could do with this completely chopped off version that was recorded internally. Okay, on to the second clip. Now, this was recorded of Brighton Pier on a very sunny day, and you can see that this looks really, really bright, and that's reflected in the waveform here. Look how far up this exposure is. So the first thing I could do is actually reduce the exposure overall. Let's just darken that down, bring those highlights down to about the 1K level. All right, and I think I'm going to darken the shadows. I'm going to extend the shadows down a bit, so let's stretch those down a bit further. And it really is completely up to you what you do here, whether you want them to include some genuine black tones in there at the risk of losing some of the shadow detail. But as you can see, if I do it the other way, you can see absolutely any detail you want in these darker areas underneath the pier. So this is looking pretty good. I think, and there's certainly no banding in the sky. That looks very nice. I also want to show you what happens when you look at the properties of that raw file. You'll see that Final Cut has read the metadata provided by the S1H and recorded by the Ninja. It already knows that it is a Panasonic camera and it's performing that raw to log conversion, and it's also automatically applied the vlog LUT because of course the raw format on the Panasonic S1H is recorded in vlog, so you will need to apply that. However, you can choose your own LUT from this list or from a custom LUT if you prefer, but we're going to stick with the Panasonic standards for this report. Now let's compare it to the log version. So once again, I'm going to apply the Panasonic vlog LUT to this clip. Here's the result. Go back to my color wheels and do exactly the same thing. I'm gonna, and there's a, there's 1,000 different ways you can achieve the same result here, and I'm not a professional color grader, but let's just see what you can do. So I'm going to reduce the overall exposure, and I'm going to reduce the shadows because I want some darker areas in that. And again, it's not silky smooth in terms of adjustments. You wouldn't describe this as buttery by any means, but it's usable. You can do it, and I have rendered out some projects already using this system. Okay, so this is the 10-bit internally recorded version with vlog, and now this is the 12-bit externally recorded raw version. And again, if you compare these waveforms that I've adjusted, there is arguably more data available on the 12-bit raw version if you're technically looking at the waveform on the left. However, when it comes to the actual final footage that I've done here, not a massive amount of difference, and really a much bigger difference could be achieved on either of these by a professional color grader, but the potential is there. And I also recorded with another camera at the same time, just a normal standard shot of the pier here, and pretty much that entire sky was blown out because the sun was on that side, so it was very brightly backlit. But now for something even tougher. So here is my third and final clip that we're going to look at, and this is the raw version. This is filmed under the pier. Now this is a really tricky situation because you're in a very deep shadow here underneath the pier. It's very, very dark, but yeah, on a bright sunny day, what is behind you is enormously bright, especially on the right hand side. Now I took the liberty of recording this internally using the 8-bit standard profile, which you can see here has just completely blown out that sea and sky area on the right hand side of the frame. I mean, you can't see anything here. And if you have a look at this waveform on the left, well, it's not going to be any surprise that if I was to try and retrieve any highlight detail, yep, I've turned it right down, you still can't see any sea or sky there. You're stuffed. That exposure is saturated. We've got some nice detail underneath the pier, but nothing is available from the highlights. However, surprise, surprise, when I go to the raw file, look at the waveform here, look at how much more tonal detail is available to us. Now, all I want to do here is just reduce the highlights to see if I can retrieve the sky and the sea. It's going to be at the cost of some detail under the pier, but again, a decent color grader would be able to do a much better job of this. So if I bring this right down, you can see that there is indeed sea behind the pier and a nice blue sky. You can retrieve that detail. Again, if I go to the 10-bit internal vlog version, let's apply a LUT to that. There we are. And go back to my color wheels. Let's see whether I can retrieve a similar amount in the sky and sea. So all I'm going to do is bring down the highlight setting on that color wheel there. And yeah, look at that. You can completely retrieve the sea and the sky. And again, if I switch between these two, I mean, I've done different adjustments here. This is pretty casual stuff. You can see the potential of both of these formats. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, I can see the benefit of both RAW and 10-bit internal vlog over filming standard 8-bit. I mean, that is very obvious. But what are the benefits of recording RAW over the 10-bit vlog? Well, if you're a stills photographer, you might assume that one of the benefits of filming video in the RAW format is the ability to completely change, say, the color temperature. And if you've been looking around my desktop here, you may well have seen a color temperature setting here within Final Cut. Now, if I just, let's do it on this shot of the pier, to see how that looks. Now, if I adjust the color temperature It starts at 5000, which is roughly daylight balance, which is what I filmed this with. I can turn it down to 2500K here. If it were filmed under, say, artificial tungsten lighting, and let's sort of turn it up to a much higher setting here, if this is what you prefer. Now, you may be assuming that this is actually adjusting the white balance of the raw file, but as far as I understand it, it is not doing that. This is a white balance simulation. It is not actually adjusting the white balance of the file. You'll notice that every file you bring in, regardless of the white balance that you recorded it in, they're all reported as 5000K within Final Cut. So this is really kind of like a software tweak. This isn't actually adjusting the raw data, as far as I understand it. So I looked into this a bit further, and it turns out that the Apple ProRes RAW format, in theory, should be able to support color temperature adjustments. It's just that the implementation that Panasonic and Atomos have done in conjunction with Apple, in conjunction with Final Cut Pro here, isn't supporting it. That's not to say that it's not possible with different combinations of equipment, or indeed the same combinations that I used in the future, but right now, as I tested it, you cannot adjust the white balance on ProRes RAW, which is a bit of a shame, because that was one of the biggest things I was looking forward to in terms of shooting RAW compared to shooting log. However, what you are getting is 12-bit files. You are getting a greater tonal dynamic range than you do typically with 10-bit log, and that does give you greater latitude for adjustments, whether those are tonal adjustments or color adjustments. You can make much bigger changes without really seeing some ugly, undesirable artifacts. So hopefully I've given you an indication of what you can do, and once again, just a reminder that everything I've shown you here was using beta firmware on both the S1H and on the Ninja 5, so final performance on final firmware may vary. But again, I'd say that is reasonably usable on a fairly modest computer. Anyway, you've seen how it looks in Final Cut. Now let's take a look at those actual files themselves in greater detail. Okay, I've rendered out some of that footage, so let's take a look at the clips in greater detail here, presented in 4K, starting with that garden clip filmed in 8-bit internally using the standard profile, where, as you recall, it was impossible to retrieve the sky in this particular exposure. Now for the external 5.9K RAW file, with the highlights retrieved successfully, although you'd probably need to adjust some more to balance the shadows out. Next up comes the 10-bit vlog internal recording with similar adjustments, and I'd say a similar result to the RAW version. And finally 10-bit internal again, but this time in HLG, where I could retrieve more sky than the 8-bit standard file, but not as much as in the RAW or vlog versions. My second clip is bright and clear on a sunny day, starting this time with the external 5.9K RAW file, with the exposure and highlights reduced to bring back the sky, while hopefully still retaining some shadow detail underneath the pier. And as you saw in my demonstration, it is possible to adjust that as much up and down as you like. Next comes the 10-bit internal recording made with vlog using similar adjustments, and again with a fairly similar result to the RAW file. And finally the 10-bit internal recording made with HLG, where again I couldn't retrieve quite as much of the saturated sky as I could with the RAW or vlog versions. My third clip was filmed under the pier, and I'm starting with an 8-bit internal recording with the standard profile, where the sky and sea on the right hand side are permanently lost. You'll recall from my Final Cut demo that no amount of adjusting on those brightness controls will bring any detail back. It's gone. Next comes the external 5.9K RAW file, where I brought the highlights right down to retrieve the sea and sky detail pretty successfully. Now for the internal 10-bit file recorded with vlog, and again with the highlights brought right down, where again the result is actually pretty similar to the RAW. In both cases you may want to tweak the shadows though if desired. And finally the 10-bit internal file recorded in HLG, where I could retrieve some highlight detail that was lost on the 8-bit standard file, but again not as much as I could from the external RAW or internal vlog versions, but your mileage may vary. From these brief tests and tweaks, my basic conclusion is the externally recorded 5.9K RAW files from the S1H unsurprisingly allowed far greater tonal adjustment than the camera's 8-bit internal files. But that 10-bit internal files, using the vlog profile, were pretty much as flexible in my own test footage. Meanwhile, 10-bit internal footage filmed in HLG didn't allow exactly the same latitude as the RAW files, but was still better than 8-bit internal. Now, of course, this was just for my initial test footage, and again, I was using beta firmware on both the S1H and the Ninja 5. More demanding material with greater adjustments, and most importantly, when applied by an experienced colour grader, could deliver more decisive differences. Certainly when editing in Final Cut, the Waveform Monitor was already revealing a greater potential range even on my basic, undemanding footage. Ultimately, while the internal 10-bit vlog files came close in my own tests, the fact is most pro videographers would be using an external monitor or recorder anyway, so going for a Ninja 5 and enjoying 12-bit ProRes RAW in 5.9K for free is pretty much a no-brainer. In the future, I'm hoping ProRes RAW will offer the kind of control that photographers expect when processing stills, like full white balance adjustment, and that's the sort of thing that's really down to Apple to decide. They need to implement it, and then Panasonic and Atomos need to, and then it needs to be supported in your software as well, but fingers crossed. However, in the meantime, filmmakers will love what they can already achieve now using the S1H, which in cinema terms is a comparatively small and affordable camera. And so long as the firmware update comes sooner rather than later, it'll crucially bring this capability to market before Canon launches the EOS R5 or Sony gets around to updating the A7S Mark II. Right, I hope you found that useful. Did you enjoy my little foray into colour grading and video editing? If you like it, let me know, I'll do more of it. If you hated it, let me know and I'll do less of it. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.